The dealer's laughter followed him all the way to the door, and for a moment, Jacob Miller stood frozen with his hand on the handle, feeling every pair of eyes in the showroom drilling into his back. They thought they were watching a stubborn man make a foolish choice. What they didn't know, what none of them could possibly know, was that this quiet decision, made in humiliation and silence, would be the reason he was still standing a decade later while half the county had vanished. From the map, Jacob stepped out into the white blaze of afternoon sunlight and let the door swing shut behind him. Stay with me until the end. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The noise of the showroom dulled into a muffled hum. In the gravel parking lot sat his old Farmall, paint faded to a tired red, metal scarred by years of honest work. To the men inside, it looked like a relic. To Jacob, it looked like survival. He walked toward it slowly, replaying the dealer's words in his head. "You keep clinging to that antique," the man had said loudly, grinning for his audience, "and you won't have a farm left in 10 years. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel in the way of outright hatred. It was worse. It was casual, dismissive. The kind of laughter that erased a man before he even had the chance to defend himself. Jacob climbed onto the tractor seat and rested his hands on the steering wheel. The metal was warm from the sun. For a few seconds, he just sat there, breathing in the familiar smell of oil and dust. This machine had carried him through storms that would have broken flashier equipment. He knew every rattle, every vibration, every stubborn quirk. Inside the dealership, they saw weakness. Here, he felt strength. The drive back to his farm cut through miles of rolling fields baked gold by late summer heat. Dust rose behind the Farmall in a long, drifting cloud. Jacob's jaw tightened as he thought about the shining green tractors lined up under fluorescent lights. They were faster, bigger, impressive in a way his machine would never be. But they came with chains. Debt was a quiet predator. He'd seen it take men stronger than him, seen neighbors sign papers with hopeful smiles and end up watching strangers auction off their lives a few years later. New equipment promised speed, but it demanded obedience. Payments didn't care about droughts or falling prices. When Jacob pulled into his yard, the farmhouse stood calm and steady against the horizon. His wife, Emma, was sitting on the porch shelling peas into a metal bowl. She looked up as he approached, reading his expression, with the ease of someone who had shared his burdens for years. "Well?" she asked gently. Jacob cut the engine and climbed down. "They laughed," he said simply. Emma didn't look surprised. She set the bowl aside and stood, wiping her hands on her apron. "And what did you do?" "I left." A faint smile touched her lips, not mocking, proud. She stepped closer and squeezed his arm. "Good. Let them laugh. Laughter doesn't pay our bills." That evening, after supper, Jacob walked out to the barn alone. The air inside was cool and dim, filled with the quiet presence of tools hanging in careful order. The Farmall sat in the center, like an old warhorse at rest. He lit a single overhead bulb and opened the engine casing. His hands moved with practiced confidence, checking bolts, tracing lines, listening to the ticking sounds of cooling metal. This was where he felt most certain. Machines made sense. They followed rules. If you understood them deeply enough, they rewarded you with loyalty. Jacob realized then that keeping this tractor wasn't just about stubborn pride, it was about mastery. If he was going to bet his future on old equipment, he would know it better than anyone else in the county. That winter became a season of transformation. While icy winds howled outside, Jacob spent long nights in the barn with manuals spread across a workbench. He studied engine diagrams until they were etched into his memory. He dismantled components piece by piece, cleaning and rebuilding them with meticulous care. Every repaired part felt like a small victory against the creeping fear the dealer had tried to plant in him. Emma would sometimes appear in the doorway with a cup of coffee, watching him work. "You're turning that tractor into family," she teased softly. Jacob smiled without looking up. It already is. By spring, the Farmall ran smoother than it had in years. When Jacob guided it into the fields for the first ploughing of the season, the engine's steady rhythm filled him with quiet confidence. He wasn't racing anyone. He wasn't trying to impress the county. He was building something durable, the say. Other farmers noticed his refusal to upgrade. At the feed store, conversations would dip when he walked in. He caught fragments of whispers. Too proud, stuck in the past, won't last long. Each comment landed like a small stone. None of them were heavy enough to crush him, but together they formed a weight he carried every day. Instead of fighting the gossip, Jacob let it fuel him. He adjusted his farming methods with obsessive care. He tracked every expense, every gallon of fuel, every hour of labor. He experimented with soil conservation techniques older farmers had abandoned in the rush toward modernization. Where others chased scale, he chased efficiency. The first hard year arrived without warning. Rain came late and left early. Crops struggled. The men with new tractors pushed their machines harder, burning fuel in desperate attempts to salvage yields. Bills stacked up like storm clouds. Jacob worked steadily. His output wasn't spectacular, but his costs stayed low. When harvest ended, he wasn't celebrating, but he wasn't panicking either. He could breathe. Then the foreclosure signs began appearing along county roads. Each one hit the community like a muted explosion. Families packed their belongings under the watchful eyes of neighbors who feared they might be next. Auction days drew silent crowds. Equipment that had once symbolized progress sold for fractions of its price. Jacob attended one auction and stood at the edge of the gathering, hands in his pockets. He watched a powerful tractor, newer and finer than anything he'd ever owned, roll onto the bidding block. The final price was shockingly low. The former owner stood nearby, face pale, eyes hollow. In that moment, the dealer's laughter echoed faintly in Jacob's memory, but it no longer sounded threatening. It sounded naive. Back on his farm, Jacob doubled his efforts. He repaired small issues before they became large ones. He shared tools and labor with neighbors who were struggling, building quiet alliances based on mutual survival rather than competition. One evening, a young farmer named Luke arrived with a broken axle and desperation in his voice. Jacob helped him weld a temporary fix that carried him through harvest. Luke tried to pay him more than he could afford. Jacob shook his head. Just remember this when someone else needs help. Word spread. Slowly, his barn became a place where men came not just for repairs, but for reassurance. They talked openly about fears they hid elsewhere. Together, they traded knowledge that modern brochures had replaced with promises of easy solutions. Through it all, the Farmall kept running. Its steady presence became a symbol of Jacob's philosophy. Understand what you depend on, and it will not betray you. Every successful season strengthened his belief that survival wasn't about chasing the newest advantage. It was about resilience. Years passed in cycles of tension and relief. Some seasons were generous, others were brutal. But Jacob remained anchored. He paid down his debts piece by piece, savoring each cleared balance like a small triumph. The dealer still operated in town, still sold shining machines to hopeful buyers. Occasionally their paths crossed. The dealer would offer a polite nod, his earlier mockery softened by time and shifting fortunes. Jacob returned the nod without bitterness. He didn't need vindication from words. He was building it acre by acre, season by season, in the quiet. Persistence of a man who understood that true strength rarely announced itself with laughter or spectacle. It revealed itself slowly, in endurance. And as the sun set over his fields one evening, painting the sky in deep amber and red, Jacob stood beside his old Farmall and felt a calm certainty settle in his chest. He wasn't behind the times. He was exactly where he needed to be. The year the sky turned against them began with a silence that every farmer in the county felt in his bones. Spring arrived, but the rain did not. By late April, Cracks had started to appear in the soil, thin at first, like hairline fractures in glass. Jacob Miller noticed them while walking his fields at dawn, boots crunching softly against earth that should have been damp and forgiving. He crouched and pressed his fingers into the dirt. It crumbled too easily. Behind him, the old Farmall ticked, quietly as it cooled, the engine's fading clicks echoing in the still air. Usually, mornings were filled with birdsong and the distant hum of other tractors. Now the world felt muted, as if everything was holding its breath. At the feed store that afternoon, the tension was thick enough to taste. Men clustered in uneasy groups, voices low and tight. "Forecast says another 2 weeks dry," someone muttered. "That'll kill the wheat," another replied. Jacob listened without speaking. Fear spread quickly in places like this. It fed on speculation and multiplied. In silence, he bought what he needed and headed back to his farm, his mind already turning over possibilities. He couldn't make it rain, but he could prepare. That evening, he and Emma sat at the kitchen table with a notebook between them. Jacob listed every expense he could cut, every adjustment he could make. Fuel usage, planting patterns, water conservation. Emma followed his reasoning with sharp, steady eyes. "We tighten now," she said, "before we're forced to." Jacob nodded. This was the advantage of their life. Decisions made early, not in panic. While other farms expanded during good years and scrambled during bad ones, they had learned to live in a narrow band of sustainability. The drought deepened through May. Fields across the county began to fade from green to a sickly yellow. The larger operations responded with brute force. Bigger tractors ran longer hours, ripping through soil in attempts to salvage yields. Irrigation pumps roared day and night, burning fuel that cost more each week. Jacob chose restraint. He adjusted his tilling to preserve what little moisture remained. He ran the Farmall at measured intervals, never pushing the land harder than it could endure. Each pass was deliberate. Each gallon of fuel was accounted for. Some neighbors saw his slower pace and mistook it for weakness. "You're falling behind," one of them warned at the edge of a shared fence line. "You've got to push harder than this." Jacob wiped sweat from his brow and looked out over the brittle field. "Pushing harder won't make water appear," he said calmly. "It'll just empty my tank faster." The man shook his head and drove off, his massive tractor roaring in defiance. By midsummer, the consequences of that defiance began to surface. Fuel deliveries became irregular. Prices spiked again. Repairs multiplied as overworked machines started to fail under relentless strain. The county mechanic's shop overflowed with broken equipment and anxious owners. One night, long after dark, headlights swept across Jacob's barn. He stepped outside to find Luke, the young farmer he'd helped before, jumping out of his truck, panic etched into his face. "My main tractor's dead," Luke said breathlessly. "Transmission's shot. Mechanic says it's a week, minimum. I can't wait that long." Jacob glanced at the fields, then back at the frightened young man. He saw himself from years earlier, standing at the edge of uncertainty. "Hook up your equipment to mine," Jacob said. "We'll work your land at first light." Luke stared at the old Farmall, doubt flickering across his features. It wasn't built for speed or scale. But desperation overruled skepticism. They worked side by side for days, the sun hammering down without mercy. The Farmall moved steadily, never spectacular, never failing. Jacob managed the pace with surgical precision, protecting the engine while squeezing every ounce of usefulness from it. Luke watched in growing disbelief. "I thought this thing was a relic," he admitted during a brief water break. Jacob patted the tractor's hood. "A relic that still works is worth more than a miracle that doesn't." By the time Luke's repairs were finished, his crop still stood. Not perfect, not abundant, but alive. He shook Jacob's hand with fierce gratitude. "You saved me," he said quietly. Jacob shook his head. "You saved yourself. I just lent you time." The drought reached its cruel peak in August. Grass turned to straw. Ponds shrank into muddy scars. The air shimmered with relentless heat. Conversations at the feed store shifted from worry to quiet. Resignation. Everyone knew the harvest would be brutal. When cutting finally began, the yields confirmed their fears. Combines crawled through thin fields, gathering less than anyone had hoped. The roar of machinery sounded hollow, stripped of its usual triumph. Each load hauled to the elevator carried a weight heavier than grain. It carried the knowledge of mounting bills and shrinking margins. Jacob's harvest was modest, but it was enough. His careful management had preserved more than expected. While others tallied devastating losses, he calculated survivable ones. The difference wasn't luck, it was discipline practiced long before the crisis arrived. Still, the emotional toll of the season pressed down on the entire community. Another auction was announced. Then another. Jacob attended one out of respect for the family involved. He stood among the crowd as familiar equipment rolled past the auctioneer's chant. The former owner, a man named Harris, stared at the ground as strangers bid on pieces of his life. When the hammer fell on Harris's tractor, the sound cracked through the air like a gunshot. Jacob felt it in his chest. That night, he sat on his porch with Emma, watching lightning flicker in distant clouds that refused to come closer. "How many more?" Emma whispered. Jacob didn't answer right away. He thought of the dealer's showroom, once vibrant with confidence. He thought of the laughter that had followed him out the door years ago. It felt like a story from another lifetime. "Too many," he said finally. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. The dealer himself pulled into Jacob's yard, his polished truck coated in a thin layer of dust. He stepped out slowly, his usual swagger muted. Lines of strain marked his face. "I need to talk to you," he said. They stood beside the barn, the Farmall visible behind Jacob like a silent witness. "Sales are collapsing," the dealer admitted. "Farmers can't keep up with payments. I've got machines sitting on the lot that nobody can afford, the bank's tightening its grip." Jacob listened without triumph. He saw a man confronting the same storm from a different angle. "I remember what I said to you," the dealer continued, eyes fixed on the ground. "About your tractor, about your farm. I was wrong." The words hung between them, heavy and sincere. Jacob felt no surge of victory, only a quiet understanding. The drought was humbling everyone, stripping away illusions with ruthless efficiency. "We're all just trying to survive," Jacob said gently. The dealer nodded, swallowing hard. "You figured out something the rest of us didn't." After he left, Jacob returned to the barn and rested his hand on the Farmall's hood. The metal was warm, steady, familiar. This machine hadn't just carried him through a drought. It had anchored him through years of doubt and pressure. Harvest ended under a sky that remained stubbornly clear. The county was changed. Empty houses dotted the landscape. Conversations were quieter, tempered by shared hardship. But among those who remained, a subtle shift had occurred. They began to value endurance over appearance. Farmers visited Jacob more frequently, not just for repairs, but for advice. They asked about soil management, fuel conservation, maintenance, routines. He shared everything he knew without hesitation. Knowledge, he believed, was meant to circulate. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in deep gold, Luke stopped by again. He leaned against the fence, surveying the land with thoughtful eyes. "You know what people are saying about you?" he asked. Jacob raised an eyebrow. "I'm not sure I want to," Luke smiled. "They're saying you're the reason some of us are still here." Jacob looked out over his modest acres. He saw the scars of drought, the resilience of surviving crops, the quiet strength of a farm built to endure rather than impress. He shook his head softly. "We're still here because we learned to bend instead of break." As twilight settled, the Farmall sat silhouetted against the fading light, a testament to that philosophy. It wasn't the fastest or the newest. It didn't command attention from a distance, but it had carried a man through one of the harshest seasons of his life, and in doing so, it had proven something deeper than any showroom promise. Strength wasn't measured by how loudly you arrived, it was measured by whether you were still standing when the dust cleared. The storm that rewrote Jacob Miller's place in the county arrived on a night so still it felt unnatural. The air all. Day had been thick and heavy, pressing down on the fields like a warning. Even the insects were quiet. Jacob noticed it while finishing repairs in the barn, sweat running down his spine despite the open doors. The Farmall sat half disassembled in front of him, its engine exposed as he replaced a worn gasket. He paused, listening. Somewhere far off, thunder murmured. Jacob stepped outside and looked west. A wall of clouds was rising, black and swollen, swallowing the horizon. Lightning flickered deep inside it like a pulse. His stomach tightened. Storms after drought were rarely gentle. The ground was too hard to absorb sudden rain. Crops that had survived months of thirst could be destroyed in minutes by wind and hail. He worked faster, hands moving with practiced urgency. The gasket slid into place, bolts tightened. He reassembled the casing and climbed into the seat. The engine turned over with a familiar growl, steady and reassuring. "Come on," he murmured, guiding the tractor toward the equipment shed. The first gust of wind hit as he closed the doors. It carried dust and the sharp metallic scent of rain. By the time he reached the farmhouse, the sky had gone nearly black. Emma stood in the doorway, eyes fixed on the approaching storm. "That one looks angry," she said. Jacob nodded. "Let's hope it's quick." It wasn't. The storm struck with violent suddenness. Wind slammed against the house, rattling windows in their frames. Rain followed in sheets so dense they erased the world beyond the porch. Thunder cracked overhead, each boom shaking the floor beneath their feet. Jacob lay awake long after midnight, listening to the chaos. Between thunderclaps, he imagined his fields bending under the assault. Wheat that had fought so hard to survive, now whipped back and forth in the darkness. He could do nothing but wait. When dawn finally came, the storm had moved on, leaving behind a strange, fragile silence. Jacob pulled on his boots and stepped outside. The air was cool and damp. Puddles filled the low spots in the yard. He walked toward his nearest field, heart pounding with each step. The damage was uneven. Some sections stood intact, glistening with rain. Others were flattened, stalks tangled in chaotic patterns. It would slow the harvest, but it wasn't catastrophic. Relief washed through him in a quiet wave. Then he heard an engine racing up the gravel road. A truck skidded into his yard, tires spraying mud. The driver's door flew open and Carl, the neighbor who had once warned him about falling behind, jumped out. His face was pale, eyes wide with panic. "Jacob!" he shouted. Striding forward, "I'm in trouble." Jacob met him halfway. "What happened?" Carl dragged a shaking hand through his hair. "The storm hit my south fields dead on, flattened almost everything. And my main combine, it's finished. Headers twisted. I can't cut a thing." Jacob felt the weight of the words settle between them. Harvest windows were narrow even in perfect conditions. With crops lodged on the ground, every hour mattered. "The mechanic says 3 days minimum," Carl continued, voice cracking. "If I wait that long, I lose most of it. I'm already stretched thin. I can't survive that kind of loss." His gaze flicked toward the barn, where Jacob's equipment sat sheltered and intact. "I need your help," Carl said quietly. For a moment, the memory of old conversations surfaced, the warnings, the doubts, the subtle dismissals. Jacob remembered standing in that dealership years ago, feeling small under the weight of laughter. He looked at Carl now and saw none of that confidence, only fear. "I'll bring my combine," Jacob said. Carl's shoulders sagged with relief. So sudden it looked painful. "Thank you," he whispered. They moved immediately. Jacob guided his machine onto the road behind Carl's truck. The fields they reached were worse than he had imagined. Acres of wheat lay pressed flat, stems twisted into stubborn knots. Cutting it would be slow, delicate work. One wrong adjustment could clog the header and waste precious time. Jacob climbed. Into the cab, and studied the tangled crop. He adjusted the reel speed, lowered the header carefully, and eased forward. The combine bit into the mess with a steady hum. Inside the cab, Jacob focused on every vibration, every sound. Years of working with aging machinery had sharpened his senses. He could feel resistance through the controls, anticipate clogs before they formed. His movements were patient, precise. Carl ran the grain cart beside him, hauling load after load, to waiting trucks. Sweat soaked through their clothes as the sun climbed higher. Dust mixed with lingering moisture, coating their skin in gritty layers. They worked without pause. Word spread quickly. Other farmers drove past and slowed, watching. The unlikely partnership. Some shook their heads in disbelief at the sight of Jacob's older machine carving methodically through devastation. By nightfall, they had cleared a fraction of the field. They didn't stop. Under portable lights, the harvest continued. The darkness amplified every sound. The steady roar of the engine, the rustle of wheat, the distant calls of night birds. Fatigue gnawed at Jacob's muscles, but he pushed it aside. Each acre saved was a victory against the storm. During a brief break, Carl leaned against the combine, chest heaving. "I don't know how you keep that thing running like this," he said. Jacob took a long drink of water. "I listen to it," he replied simply. "Machines talk if you pay attention." Carl looked at the battered exterior with newfound respect. "I used to think newer meant better. Now I'm not so sure." Jacob offered a tired smile. "Better means dependable. Everything else is decoration." They returned to work. By the end of the second day, the last of the lodged wheat lay safely harvested. The field stretched behind them in neat rows, a testament to relentless effort. Carl shut off the grain cart and stood staring at the cleared land, disbelief softening into gratitude. "You saved my farm," he said quietly. Jacob climbed down from the cab, legs trembling with exhaustion. "No," he answered. "We saved it together." Carl shook his head. "I couldn't have done this without you, without that machine." A small group of farmers had gathered at the edge of the field, drawn by the story unfolding in real time. They approached slowly, eyes fixed on the combine. One of them spoke. "We've been watching you two work. Didn't think it was possible to pull that off." Jacob wiped his hands on a rag. "It's possible if you're willing to go slow and do it right." The men exchanged glances. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that the old assumptions about progress and power had cracks in them. The following week, at the co-op meeting, Carl stood up in front of the assembled farmers. His voice wavered at first, then steadied as he described the storm, the damage, and the desperate gamble that had followed. "Jacob's machine saved my harvest," he said plainly, "and his knowledge saved me from losing everything, the pie." Room fell silent. All eyes turned to Jacob, seated near the back. He felt heat rise in his face, uncomfortable with the attention. He hadn't acted for praise. He had acted because it was necessary. Then someone began to clap. The sound spread, filling the room with a rolling wave of applause. It wasn't loud or flashy. It was deep and sincere. Respect earned through action rather than words. Jacob inclined, his head slightly, acknowledging it without embracing it. What mattered wasn't the applause. It was the shift he felt in the room, a collective reconsideration of what strength looked like. After the meeting, farmers approached him one by one. They asked questions about maintenance, about working lodged crops, about managing equipment under pressure. Jacob answered each patiently, sharing hard-won knowledge without reservation. Driving home that evening, he felt a quiet satisfaction settle over him. Not pride exactly, something steadier, a sense that the years of discipline and doubt had converted into a moment of clarity. Back at the farm, the sunset painted the sky in streaks of crimson and gold. The Farmall and combine rested in the barn, engines cooling after their ordeal. Jacob ran a hand along the familiar metal, gratitude swelling in his chest. These machines were more than tools. They were partners in a philosophy built on patience. understanding, and resilience. Emma joined him in the doorway, slipping her hand into his. "Sounds like you made quite an impression today," she said softly. Jacob gazed out over the fields, where harvested rows caught the fading light. "I just did what needed doing," he replied. Emma smiled. "Sometimes that's enough to change everything." As darkness settled, Jacob felt the truth of her words. The storm had tested more than crops. It had tested beliefs about progress, about pride, about what it meant to endure. And standing there beside the machines that had carried him through it, Jacob understood something with absolute certainty: real. Strength wasn't loud, it was steady. And when the next storm came, as storms always did, he would meet it the same way he always had: grounded, prepared, and unafraid to trust the path he had chosen. 10 years after the laughter in that dealership, Jacob Miller woke before dawn on a morning that felt different. He couldn't have said exactly why at first. The air was cool and clean, carrying the faint scent of harvested wheat. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the kitchen clock. Emma was still asleep upstairs. Jacob poured himself coffee and stepped out onto the porch. The farm stretched before him in soft blue shadows. His fields lay trimmed and orderly after a successful harvest. The barn stood solid against the horizon. Nothing about the scene was dramatic. There were no flashing signs of victory, and yet a deep, steady realization settled into his chest. They had made it, not just through a season or a storm, but through a decade that had erased farms stronger and larger than his. He sipped his coffee slowly, letting the truth of it sink in. Every acre beneath that fading darkness was his. Paid for, cared for, still producing. Behind him, the screen door creaked softly. Emma stepped onto the porch and slipped her arm around his waist. "You're up early," she murmured. "So are you," he replied. She followed his gaze across the land and smiled, understanding without explanation. "It's a good morning," she said. "It is," Jacob agreed quietly. Later that day, he drove into town to finalize paperwork at the bank. The building looked smaller than he remembered, its brick facade worn by years of wind and sun. Inside, the banker slid a document across the desk with a respectful nod. "That's the final confirmation," he said. "Your land is officially clear." Jacob signed his name with steady hands. When the pen left the paper, a weight he hadn't fully acknowledged lifted from his shoulders. He thanked the banker and stepped back into the sunlight, feeling lighter than he had in years. Word traveled fast in a small county. By evening, neighbors began arriving at the farm. Some brought food, others carried bottles or folding chairs. No one had organized it formally, but everyone understood the significance. In a time when survival itself had become an achievement, Jacob's milestone belonged to the whole community. They gathered in the yard as the sun dipped low, casting long golden shadows. Laughter rose easily, but it carried a different tone than the laughter Jacob remembered from the dealership. This was warm, grounded in shared hardship and mutual respect. Carl clapped him on the shoulder. "You did it," he said, grinning. 10 years ago, nobody would have bet on this." Jacob shrugged lightly. "I didn't do anything special, just kept going." "That's exactly what's special," Luke added from nearby. "Most people couldn't."